A very warm welcome to this Hermes webinar. We're going to just take 1 minute of silence to check that everything is working, and then we will begin. Oh yes, I see people arriving. Everything looks wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So no mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa, a very warm welcome to this Hermes webinar. My name is Talia Keogh-Rowden and I'm part of the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, or Hermes, as we call ourselves for short. We are a global data platform working to power a human rights revolution with world-changing data tools. Importantly, we are non-profit and independent from governments. I'm your host for today's conversation, as we release brand new human rights data to the world right now. I know people will continue to arrive for another minute or two, so I'll just start with some housekeeping bits and pieces. So before we begin, please do use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout. We may or may not have time for a live Q&A session at the end, but we will have a lot of team members able to answer your questions in the Q&A box as we continue. So do feel free to submit questions along the way. You're probably aware this session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after the webinar. Of course, none of you will appear in the recording, just those of us who are speaking. Now, feel free to view the new data on your own screen as we go through it today. It's live now at rightstracker.org. And please consider when we're finished, or right now, following us on social media. We are at Rights Metrics for Twitter and Facebook. And on LinkedIn, you can find us just at Human Rights Measurement Initiative. And those links will be in the chat box later on through the webinar as well for easy clicking. We are very glad to have you all with us today, drawn together by a common commitment to making our world better, kinder and fairer. Today, I'm coming to you from Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I know we have people with us from all over the world, particularly in the Pacific, Africa, Europe and the Americas, where it's awake time. A warm welcome to you all. Also with me today are several members of the Hermes team and also a special invited guest, Lena Simmet from Human Rights Watch. Now, we can't see all your faces, but we'd like to start by inviting you to respond to this poll, asking what part of the world you are in or from. Now, of course, this is optional. So what part of the world are you coming to us from now? Or where are you from? We'll take a minute just to get some responses coming through. And I think Yo-Yo can make the poll public so we can all see the responses. A lot from the Americas, and I think then Pacific and Europe are next in line. Someone from Asia coming in the middle of the night. Thank you so much for coming. Brilliant. Thank you all for being here at different times of the day, for all of you, for making time in your day to learn something new or to see what's going on in the world of human rights data. So my second question is, what kinds of things are you interested in at the moment? Which of the 5 rights that we measure that we're talking about today are you particularly interested in? We group our scores into 5 broad categories. You can see the icons for them on this slide: the rights to education, food, health, housing, which includes water and sanitation, and work, which includes adequate income. So are some of those particularly your interest here today? Let us know. Looks pretty even from what I'm seeing, and Yo-Yo will share the results shortly. I think health is just slightly ahead of everyone else. But I know that, I mean, all of these rights overlap. I know that you will all be interested in many more than just one issue. In a moment, we'll show you around some of the new data in all of those areas that you're interested in and demonstrate some of the ways you can sort it and interpret it. First, my colleague Mena Abdel Wahab will take you on a rights tracker tour focusing on data for Africa and the Middle East. Then Eduardo in Brazil is going to interview Dr. Annie Watson in the US to get an overview of what our people at risk data are showing this year in a few countries. And then we'll be joined by Dr. Susan Randolph, co-founder of Hermes and our economic and social rights lead, to talk about an exciting new piece of data that we've published for China this year. A group of colleagues from all over the world will then give a whistle-stop tour of a few regional trends. We have Zemfira, Tauliant, Otto, Amy, and Momoko. And then I'll ask Susan about how our data can be useful for anyone working on the SDGs, the global goals. And Dr. Stephen Bagwell will join us to talk about the impact of COVID-19. We'll close by hearing from our special guest, Lena Simmet from Human Rights Watch, reflecting on the new data and what's needed from the world's leaders right now. So the 2022 data are now live right now on rightstracker.org. We at Hermes produce robust numbers showing how well governments treat people. We publish all our data on the Rights Tracker, and they're freely available to anyone in the world to use. You can download the entire data set if you want as well. I'd like to show you a short video now, an animated explanation of how and why we measure economic and social rights. You can find it on our YouTube channel later. We'll put that link in the chat box. So now I'm going to pass over to Yo-Yo to play the video.
Human rights release human potential. How do we tell if countries are respecting people's human rights and allowing them to flourish? If we want leaders to prioritize human rights, we need to measure them. What gets measured gets improved. Leaders of countries love numbers. What's GDP growth this quarter? How many people are out of a job? But do leaders have all the most important numbers? The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, HRMI, is filling a gap in the human rights ecosystem. We use award-winning and peer-reviewed methodologies to track the human rights performance of countries and publish scores each year on our rights tracker. We want countries to strive to climb to the top, to do their very best. We want leaders to call in their advisors and ask what they need to do to get their human rights scores up. But where is the top? When it comes to the rights to education, food, health, housing, and work, what target should a country aim for, especially when every country has a different level of income to spend? International human rights law says that every country needs to do their very best to devote their maximum available resources to improving their people's quality of life. This is called progressive realization. Hermes scores are the first in the world to measure progressive realization, so countries at any level of income can know how well they're doing and have a realistic target to aim for, a goal they're capable of reaching. We discover the realistic target by finding out which countries have the best results at every level of income and comparing each country to that benchmark. We do it like this. Let's take the percentage of young people enrolled in secondary school in every country around the world. We take all the results for the last 20 years and plot them on this graph. Each dot is one country's result for 1 year. There's a big range. At any level of income, for rich countries and poor ones, there are some places that are setting the target, doing the best we've ever seen, and some that are a long way behind. How close to the target is a country getting? That's the Hermes score, given as a percentage of the target. Every country should be able to get near its 100% target. The lower the score, the more urgent the need for improvement. A low-income country getting 100% will most likely need more resources to improve its people's lives further. You can take these scores to government leaders. Show Guatemala's government that they are far behind other countries with the same level of wealth, even among their local neighbors. Show Malaysia that at their high level of income, they could achieve so much more. You can even combine our scores with population data to show, for instance, that if Guatemala went from its current score to the target of 100%, over 1 million extra young people would be in secondary school. Human rights release human potential and let people flourish. You can harness the power of Hermes' economic and social rights scores to fuel your country's climb to the top, its quest to be its very best. Go to rightstracker.org now.
Thank you, Yo-Yo. And you could see that video, anybody, at any time on our YouTube channel. We also have another one for our civil and political rights if you're also interested in those. The links for videos and everything else are going to go in the chat box. I'm now going to hand over to Menna Abdelwahab to take us on a tour of the Rights Tracker. So over to you, Menna.
Thank you so much, Talia. So for part of our conversation today, we want to show you guys how you can access our data, as well as provide a few pointers in terms of understanding the data. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. All right. And if you can let me know once you're able to see that. Perfect. So there are a couple of different ways you can get to the Rights Tracker. The easiest way is just to go to rightstracker.org, but you can also Google Hermes Rights Tracker or go to our humanrightsmeasurement.org website. And from there, you'll see a big button that leads you to the Rights Tracker. Before we start diving deep into the data, I do want to make note of the fact that the Rights Tracker is available in a couple of different languages. So if you go up here to the right-hand corner, you can press the downward arrow and click on the language that you are most comfortable working in. For today, we are going to be using English. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can approach looking at our data. If you're someone who's interested in a specific right or a specific category of rights, you can go to the Rights tab, click on the downward arrow, and click on the right that you're most interested in. This will lead you to a page that provides you data for all the countries for which we have data on that right. If you're interested in a specific country, you can go to the Countries tab, type or scroll down to the country that you're interested in, and this will lead you to a page that has all the data for that country. Finally, if you're interested in a specific group of people and want to understand their experiences, you can click on the People tab, then scroll or type in the name of the people group that you're interested in, and this will lead you to a page that shows you all the countries for which that people group is considered people at risk. To start us off for today, I'm going to be going to the country page for Liberia. So I'm going to go to the Countries tab and then type in Liberia. So when you click on a country, you'll be led to the country page, and the first thing that you'll see is this at a glance page. This at a glance page provides you with a high-level overview of the data that we have for that country. This can be a good way to get a global sense of what type of data we have, but there is a lot more detail that we have to offer. So I recommend that you click through the other tabs. We house our economic and social rights data under the Quality of Life tab, so that's the tab that I'm going to be going to. The first thing that you may notice when you go to a Quality of Life page is the summary score. This summary score provides you a general understanding of how the country is performing on the issue of quality of life. It is an aggregate score of all 5 rights that we consider under quality of life, which are the right to education, the right to food, the right to health, the right to housing, and the right to work. Another thing you may notice is the fact that it says % of income adjusted benchmark achieved. So I want to take a moment and just talk about why this is important. As the video mentioned, one of the things that makes Hermes data unique is that we do consider a country's income when determining its performance on economic and social rights. We do that for 2 reasons. First, because in international law, there is the idea of progressive realization, which means that as countries' level of income improves, we also expect their level of respect for economic and social rights to improve. So international law does tie a country's level of income to its performance on economic and social rights. Another reason why this is really important is that a lot of times governments will say, yes, we could be doing better on the right to education, but if only we had more money. But because our data is considering a country's level of income in terms of assessing its performance on these economic and social rights, you're able to actually say, even with the level of income that you have right now, you're still not doing everything you can. I want to also touch on the fact that for Hermes scores, 100% is achievable. We figure out what 100% is by looking at the highest level of respect we have seen another country within that income bracket achieve. So 100% is an achievable goal because we've seen it happen before, and we expect all countries to get 100% or as close to 100% as possible. Another thing that I want to make note of is the fact of how do you understand these percentages, right? I think a lot of times people look at these percentages as test scores, and that's not exactly the best way to look at these scores. So for example, if you get an 82% or 82.5, so 83% on a test, like that's a passing score, right? That's not a bad score. However, I think one of the more useful ways to look at it is to think of it in terms of completion of a task. A really good example that Talia likes to give is if you asked your roommate or your flatmate to do the dishes and they said, oh, absolutely, I will do them, but then they only did 82 or 83% of the dishes, you'd be a little confused and a little upset, right? Because you expected them to do 100%. So anything less than 100% means that the country that we're looking at is not using its resources in the most efficient manner possible and that it's not meeting its obligation under international law. I'm going to keep scrolling down a little bit, but I do want to point out that if you're ever looking at a score and you want to know more information or you're not really sure what that score entails, you can always just click on the score and you'll see that on the right-hand side, more information pops up. It provides you the opportunity to look at how other countries are performing the score, how we define it, etc. So this can be a useful way to get more information if you ever do have questions. We're also happy to answer questions. As we scroll down, we'll see that we have these summary statements. These summary statements provide further context for the scores that we're looking at. For example, you can see that the last statement says that compared with other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Liberia is performing worse than average on quality of life rights. So this can be a good place to get more context for the rights you're looking at, and could also be a place that leads you to ask more questions and look further into the data. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more and we'll see here we have a portion called Quality of Life Full Details. This is useful information because it allows you to see how a country is performing on a specific right with more detail. So we can see here, for example, for the right to education, that Liberia has a score of 35.9. We may be interested to see, why is this? And we see that there are two components that we're considering in the right to education. They are the right to primary education and the right to secondary education. And while Liberia's score on both of these isn't great, we see that it's doing particularly worse on secondary education. So if I was someone working in this field, seeing this may encourage me to figure out ways that we can improve performance on the right to secondary education, or just look more into that issue. Scrolling down a little bit more, we will see that we have sex disaggregated data for these rights. I want to take a second and explain what this data tells us. So what this data is doing is that it's comparing Liberia's level of respect for the right to education for its female population to all other countries' level of respect for the right to education for their female populations, given that those countries are in the same income bracket as Liberia. So we're comparing female populations in Liberia and their experience with the right to education to all other females in other countries in a similar income bracket. And we're doing the same for men. We're comparing the level of respect for the right to education for men in Liberia to other countries in a similar income brackets experiences when it comes to the right to education. The reason I think this is important is that sometimes someone may look at the score and say, oh, there are 35% of women in Liberia who are in school. And that's not exactly what this data is trying to tell us. Instead, this data is trying to provide us with the opportunity to understand how Liberia is doing compared to other countries. I'm going to switch over to another country just so that we can get some exposure to another country's data. So I'm going to be going to Angola. And similarly, I'm initially going to land on the at a glance page, and to look more into the economic and social rights data, I'm going to go to the quality of life page. All right, so continuing to scroll down, we see there's the same exact format. We try to make the rights tracker as accessible and easy to navigate as possible. So we try to use the same format across all platforms or all different countries. And for Angola, I'm going to be looking at the overtime data for the right to work. So we do have data on our website that lets you see how a country has been performing in terms of a specific right over time. I was looking at this and I thought Angola's experiences or performance on the right to work was particularly interesting because we see that it did decrease a little bit between 2007 and 2008. And then we see once again that there was even a bigger decrease between 2017 and 2018. I think this data is really interesting, and a lot of times when we're looking for article ideas or just to understand more about a country's experience over time, we look at this over time data. So I think it's a really interesting and valuable part of the work and of the data that Hermes has to offer, and I definitely encourage people to look more into this over time data. Finally, I want to talk about a really unique aspect of Hermes data, which is at the people at risk section. So for all the countries for which we distribute our survey, which is, I think at this point, almost 50 countries, we have people at risk data. So we ask our human rights experts, who are the people in this country that are experiencing or particularly at risk for experiencing a violation of any given right? So we can see, for example, that in Angola, indigenous people are at particular risk for having their right to education violated. The bigger the name and the bolder the name, the more that people group is at risk. You can also take your cursor and put it above that name, and it'll give you the exact percentage. So we see here that 67% of our human rights experts identified indigenous people as being at risk of having this right violated. I do want to point out that just because a group of people is not listed here doesn't mean that they're not at risk at all of facing a violation for a right. It just means that our human rights experts did not identify them as being at particular risk. Finally, I want to scroll down to our qualitative data section. So this is another really unique part of Hermes' work. This is data that's pretty hard to find in terms of other data sources. And this is data that we're getting directly from people who are working and living in the countries that we are providing data for. So here we provide our human rights experts with the opportunity to provide us more detail about the way or the specific people groups that are at risk. So we can see, for example, that students were at risk in Angola for facing a violation of the right to education, specifically because of poor infrastructure and a lack of public services. We also see, for example, that there are specific geographic locations where people are at risk for a violation of the right to education. So overall, this qualitative data is really, really useful, and it's insightful, and it's something that is really unique to the work that Hermes is doing. I want to transition from looking at countries to looking more broadly at rights. And so I'm going to start off by looking at the right to food. To do that, I'm going to take my cursor and go up to rights. And then I'm just going to type in right to food. And when I go to this page, I'm able to see the data of all the countries for which we have data in terms of the right to food. Now, if I was interested in getting a really global view, I could look through all these scores, but if I have a more regional focus, I can apply a country filter. So I'm going to be adding a country filter, and I'm going to be focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the first things you may notice is that Gambia has a score of 100%. So I do want to take a minute and explain this. This score does not mean that everyone in Gambia is having their right to food respected. What this does mean is that given its current level of income, Gambia is using its resources in the most efficient manner and achieving the highest possible level of respect for this right. So that doesn't mean that there's no room for improvement, but just means that given its current income, it is doing all it can. Overall, looking per region and overall looking at other countries' scores can be really useful in terms of motivating government actors to care about an issue, right? So you can look at this score and you can say, I live in country X and there's country Y that we consider ourselves comparable to, and they're actually doing a lot better on this right than we are. And that can really be something that motivates government actors or the general populace in a country to care about an issue. I am also going to look at another right. I'm going to look at the right to health. And so to do that, I'm going to go back to rights. I'm going to type in right to health. And once again, being led to a page that gives me all the data for that right for all the countries for which we have that right. We have that data, excuse me. I'm going to actually remove the Sub-Saharan Africa filter and apply the MENA filter. So I thought this was really interesting. I'm from the region, I'm from Egypt, and so I just wanted to look more into this. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this was that Saudi Arabia was considered to be to have the worst score on the right to health compared to all other countries in the MENA region. So I wanted to understand why. And so just through some clicking around, I was able to look at the different aspects that are considered under the right to health. And specifically what I looked at was the right to reproductive health. And And scrolling down, found that Saudi Arabia had a score of 14.1, which is absolutely the worst score in the region when it comes to the right to health, specifically the right to reproductive health. So I thought this was really interesting. I would definitely think that Saudi Arabia's low score on the right to reproductive health is contributing to its overall low score on the right to health. And I think doing something like this is really a testament to how useful it can be just to do some clicking around and exploring, asking some questions and looking deeper into the data that Hermes has to offer. There's definitely so much data on the rights tracker that can really help answer a lot of our questions, and in some ways, and a lot of times, lead to even more questions. And so I hope that you will take the time to explore the rights tracker, whether it be a specific country or a specific right that you're interested in. I will add that the rights tracker has so much more information, and we're always happy to answer any questions or provide workshops on the rights tracker and our data. So I hope that this was useful in terms of getting an overview of our data. And now I'm going to hand it over to Eduardo.
Thanks, Manna. And we also have with us today Annie Watson, an assistant professor of political science at Middle Georgia State University, and also happens to be one of our research fellows on women and children's rights. And Annie is here to speak with us about our people at risk and qualitative data. Annie, can you tell us a little about the global trends that emerge from people at risk data for economic and social rights?
Absolutely. So when it comes to our quality of life, differences in enjoyment of rights or perceptions of this enjoyment rely less on what people do, their occupations, their political activities, and more on personal characteristics like what they look like, who their families are, where they live, and how they move through society. If I had to pick one group that is most commonly associated with increased risks of human rights violations, though, I would pick homelessness. Either people experiencing homelessness generally or youths experiencing homelessness in particular, or both, had or shared with other identities the highest perception of risk for the right to work in 20% of the countries we surveyed, the right to health in 25% of countries, the right to education in 35%, food in 40%, and housing in more than 50% of countries. And in between 83 and 90% of our countries, depending on the right, at least one respondent identified one of these groups as being at risk. And this makes sense. People experiencing homelessness are, by definition, not enjoying their right to stable, secure housing. Without housing, it's also very difficult to store food, especially perishables, or prepare for job interviews, or do homework. Any personal property you have may be at risk. Your physical safety may be at risk. It can have devastating effects on every area of someone's life. The category with the second highest perception of risk across rights in countries is people with low social or economic status, and the immigrant, people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and everyone categories are right behind them.
Annie, can you give us an example of a country that meets exactly this trend you just described to us?
So China, one of the new countries for our survey this year, is a great example. People experiencing homelessness, youths experiencing homelessness, and people with low social or economic status had the highest perceptions of risk for 4 of the 5 rights: food, education, health, and housing. At least 50% and as many as 73% of our respondents saw these groups as being at risk for abuses of these rights. Our qualitative data also add some very useful context for these experiences. The lack of regulations for unhealthy foods, ineffective safety laws, and lax enforcement of regulations mean that everyone except for powerful political figures struggle with food safety, to the point that in some cases it leads to medical concerns. Extremely high medical costs limit access to healthcare for all but the very wealthy, which would make it difficult to address those and other medical concerns. And high prices and state-controlled housing markets make purchasing a home all but impossible. When we look at education, we see that schools in rural areas, which are also likely to demonstrate higher poverty rates, they're often closed down. Where they are open, girls are less likely to be able to access them, and materials are often not offered in appropriate languages for different ethnic groups, including Uyghurs, Mongolians, and Tibetans. Special needs education institutions are also very expensive, which makes them inaccessible for children with disabilities who don't come from wealthy families. I have to note, though, that while we do see greater numbers of respondents identifying certain groups as being at risk, every category we offer on the survey was chosen at least once. all 39, which means that ultimately anyone without wealth and significant political power is at risk of having their rights violated in China.
And are there any countries where this global trend don't hold true?
Venezuela is one case that comes to mind. Here, the all people category is either the top or one of the top categories for all 5 quality of life rights, with as many as 88% of our respondents identifying everyone in the country as being at risk, in this case for the right to work. This is a function of the economic crises, the corruption, and the violence that have plagued the country since the late 2000s. No one's safe from that. India also shows some interesting deviations from the global trends. While we do still see the big 3 I named before, people experiencing homelessness, youths experiencing homelessness, and people with low social or economic status having high perceptions of risk, they're joined by other groups in those top 3 risk categories, particularly migrants and immigrants, indigenous peoples, and people from particular cultural backgrounds or castes. We see concerns about Adivasis, who are indigenous peoples in India, members of castes such as the Dalits, particularly women, and members of denotified and nomadic tribes, especially those living in Bihar, highlighted across all 5 rights in our qualitative data.
And what does it mean for people who aren't identified by respondents as being at risk? Does it mean by any chance that their rights aren't at risk?
Not at all. Like Minna mentioned before, we like to look at our people at risk data as more of a floor, not a ceiling. The groups that respondents identify as being particularly at risk are the ones that they're thinking about in the moment. If we were able to prod them to think about specific examples, it's likely they could identify ways in which those groups are at risk as well. So a group being identified by respondents means that their rights are definitely at risk. But groups who aren't identified may still be at risk as well. Additionally, we have to remember that these data are strictly focused on 2021, which means they don't necessarily reflect abuses that are happening right now. That means that our people at risk data for the right to health in the United States, for example, don't reflect the fact that the Supreme Court just gutted the national level protections for abortion. There is no mention of abortion in the qualitative data, and only 14% of our respondents identified women and girls' right to health as being at risk. We'll have to wait for next year's surveys to see the incorporation of recent events like these.
And is there a particular group whose people at risk results stood out or surprised you in any kind of way?
My counterpart, Liz Koletsky, and I are working on initiating Hermes child rights workstream, and we were particularly struck by the responses about children. In this year's survey, respondents from 38 countries identified children as being at risk of experiencing violations of at least one right. And of the 13 rights covered by the people at risk data, there was only one right that our respondents didn't identify as at risk for children in at least some of our countries, and that was freedom from death penalty executions. On the whole, though, rates of respondents identifying children as being at risk are relatively low. Where they do identify children as being at risk, more respondents are likely to focus on the quality of life rights. So education is the category of one of the categories with the highest perception of risk for 17 countries, nearly half. Food is right behind it with 14 countries, but it's really rare to see the empowerment rights show up. Assembly and political participation only have or share the highest perception of risk for children in 2 countries in our data. And yet we know it's incredibly rare to see governments allow children to vote, and institutions like children's parliaments, where they exist, are often very limited. This kind of gap is reflective of the more general approach to children's rights around the world. We know a lot more and have a lot more data on children's rights to health and education, but information about civil and political rights is a lot more limited. Liz and I, along with Oliver Fiala at Save the Children, also have a post on ECPR's political science blog, The Loop, coming out next month. In it, we discuss the dramatically different experiences that children have based on other identities they hold: gender, wealth, location, and so on. If anyone listening is particularly interested in children's rights, I encourage you to keep an eye out for that post. And Liz and I would also love to hear from you as we work with our contacts at international children's rights organizations and other stakeholders to create our framework for measuring children's rights here at Hermes.
Thanks, Annie, and looking forward to read the post you mentioned. Now we're going to hand things over to Talia and Susan to look at the behind the numbers with China's rights code.
Thanks, Eduardo.
Thanks so much. So Susan, welcome. In the 2022 update, we want to start by talking about something new and exciting. We've piloted a new tool we're calling Behind the Numbers for China. Can you tell us what's there for economic and social rights?
Sure. The Behind the Numbers tab not only provides a narrative discussion of the bar charts that you see there on the screen, but it also translates those scores in terms to show how many additional people would enjoy the right if the country were doing as well as possible given its income.
So we're turning the scores into population numbers. Can you tell me more?
Sure. One of the big takeaways from our economic and social rights data is that countries already have the potential to dramatically improve people's lives. That is, there's scope to improve people's well-being without increasing per capita income. It's also true that small improvements can make a big difference in terms of people's lives. So let's, for example, take the right to food. And this is the right that China received one of its best scores on. It received a score of 96.4. And that we would rate as good. And it's obviously not very far from 100. But still, there is a shortfall between what has been achieved and what could potentially be achieved if China's used its current resources in the most effective manner possible. And those people that are likely to fall in the gap and have their rights denied are exactly those people that Annie discussed, the Uyghurs and groups like that. So what our data show, if we translate them into people terms, is that even in this case where we have very good performance, 2.5 million children under 5 years of age would enjoy the right to food if China were doing as much as it could at its current per capita income level. So sort of thinking a little bit further about what that means in terms of people's lives, it means that over 2.5 million kids wouldn't be needlessly stunted, nor would they suffer from hunger. And then there's consequences of being stunted. So, for example, it also means that those same 2.5 million kids wouldn't have their ability to learn reduced, nor would they be so likely to be susceptible to typical childhood illnesses and suffer complications at high rates that include death. So that's just for a right where we have very good performance in China. But let's now take a look at the right that China performed worse on, and that's the right to housing. And specifically, what we're looking at here is access to housing with water and at least basic sanitation. And these obviously are essential to well-being. So China's score here was 87.2. You might say, not so bad, but actually the numbers involved in China's case are absolutely staggering. So we actually have a little infographic that you can see on the screen there, and it shows those that are enjoying the right in blue and those that are not enjoying the right in red. But each one of those red figures represents a lot of people. So what it really means here is if China used the best practices to ensure the right to water and sanitation, there would be 106 million more people that would have access to water on their premises. And an even larger number, 129 million additional people would have access to at least basic sanitation in their homes. And those benefits, of course, would spill over into improving other human rights, such as nutrition, health, and even work outcomes.
Those numbers are absolutely staggering and really powerful, I think. So tell me, Susan, can people find those numbers for other countries too? At the moment, only China on the rights tracker.
Right. I guess I'd have to answer that with a yes and a no. Okay. Yes, we do not yet have the financing to be able to compute these numbers for all countries and put them on the rights tracker. Having said that, however, we are definitely looking for money to do so. So if anybody has a few extra dollars, please do send them our way for that purpose. We would be grateful. At the same time, we have a number of our team who are trying to calculate these numbers for a number of additional countries. And we're going to be releasing those in the next couple of weeks, or months, as they become available. So you should be able to have those. In the meantime, if somebody is good at numbers, you can certainly calculate these figures yourself by simply using our downloaded data and getting access to publicly available population counts from sources such as World Development Indicators.
Thank you, Susan. And we're going to hear a bit more from you later on in our session together. And if anyone listening wants these figures for a particular country, do feel free to get in touch with me and we'll see what we can manage. We'll see what our team has capacity for. Now I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Zemfira, who is in Tbilisi in Georgia. And she's the first of 5 who are going to give a very brief, quick whistle-stop tour of a few particular regions in the world, just looking at some of the things that are standing out. So over to you, Zemfira.
Thank you, Talia. I'm going to share my screen. So as Talia already mentioned, I'm going to look at a specific region, and it's post-Soviet countries. And to do that, I'm going to go to our tab Rights, and I'm going to choose every right and look at every right, how the countries are performing, which of them are best on their specific right and which of them are worst. So the first one is a right to education. And if you open a right to education, you're going to see the big list of the countries that we have a data for on this rate. But I want to narrow down. So to do that, I'm going to go to our filter and to choose a region, Europe and Central Asia. But still, the list is quite big. So I'm going to add one more filter, and I'm going to go by income group and choose low and middle income. The thing is that out of 15 countries that were part of the Soviets, 12 of that countries is in this income group. So it's gonna narrow down our list. So you can see list is much less now. So the first country here on the top is Tajikistan, which is post-Soviet country, and it's doing almost 100% on the right to education on what is possible on that level of income that it has now. And the worst country out of post-Soviet countries is Moldova. Moldova is not well on the right to education. So the next right is right to food. And here we see different picture. Here, Moldova is actually scoring on the top, and is doing pretty well on the right to food. And the worst out of post-Soviet countries here is doing Azerbaijan, which is visibly worse than other countries, and it has quite a big room for improvement on the right to food. The next right in our set is right to health. On the right to health, Belarus is on the top of the list. This score is not particularly great score, but it's the best that we have among post-Soviet countries. And the worst among this set of countries is Azerbaijan again. So Azerbaijan is doing not well also on the right to health. Then we go to right to housing. Right to housing, if we look at this list, we see that Turkmenistan scoring almost 100% on the right to housing on that level of income that it has now. And the worst is Moldova, and pretty close to it, Russia, with 1% difference. So these two countries are doing not well on the right to housing among post-Soviet countries. And the last that we have in our set of economic social rights is a right to work. And on right to work, many of post-Soviet countries doing quite well. So Tajikistan and Belarus scoring 100% of what is possible on that level of income that they have. And Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Russia, also Kyrgyzstan and Moldova scoring almost 100% on the right to work. The worst is Georgia. And as a person who is right at the moment here, I can say that is true. The rate of unemployment is here quite high. And to sum up, I would say that Tajikistan is better than average in the Central Asia, and Azerbaijan is worse than average in Central Asia. Belarus is better than average in Europe, and Moldova is close to average, but it's performing quite bad on a right to education and a right to housing. So that's all with me, and I'm gonna pass to my colleague Tauland.
Hi everyone, my name is Tauland Jedile, and today I will be presenting the data that Hermes has on the Americas region. I'm sharing my screen now, and I will continue on to go to the quality of life section and choose the Americas region as the rights that we're going to be interpreting. These rights include the right to education, food, health, housing, and work. Currently, we are viewing these states based on the income adjusted option, which tells us that how good these countries are performing based on their GDP, their capacity to provide to its citizens. As we can see, Chile is performing on top with a 95.3%. Meanwhile, countries like Honduras, Panama, and Guatemala are performing lower on the list with a 77.7, 76.5, and 66.2%. An honorable mention here is the United States, which is only performing at 91.3, because due to its reputation and influence on the international community, it's performing quite low. Our rights tracker enables us to view data also individually based on the region. And today we're going to be looking at the right to health in this region, which is going to show us the list of the countries that we have data on. And on top of the list is Nicaragua with a 96.1%. Meanwhile, on the bottom of the list, we have Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana with a 72.9, 72.2, and 69.3%. While we are currently looking at the income adjusted viewing option, we can also view this data based on how these countries are doing compared to other countries globally instead of their capacity based on GDP, which we're gonna change right now. And now we can see that the list has changed a bit. Now Uruguay lies on top of the 92.5%. Meanwhile, Haiti is at the bottom of the list with a 63.9%. We can also see here that the United States is a bit lower with a 82.2%. Now, due to time constraint, I'm only going to be adding that we can also view this data based on what treaty ratifications these states have made, which we currently include the International Convention on Political and Civil Rights, and also the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I will stop sharing my screen now and pass the stage on to my colleague, Otto. Thank you.
Thank you, Tauland, and hello, everyone. I'll be focusing particularly on the Pacific region and our countries within the Pacific region. So if you would kindly follow with me, I'll be going through the observed individual ESR rights, commenting on the scores of certain countries. And so firstly, to do that, we'll head to the rights tab and click on the first individual ESR right, which is the right to education. As you can see, before Zemfira has demonstrated the first page with 160 countries observed. So we'll be adding a filter, and keeping the Pacific in mind, I will click on the Pacific subregion tag. Now you will see that Nauru has the top score with 96.5%, while the lowest score is held by the Marshall Islands at 65.4%. Though Nauru holds the top spot, we know that the most feasible score is 100%, and currently Nauru is only performing 96.5% of what it's able to accomplish at its income level. Advancing over to the next right, we have the right to food. This shows the scores for 10 countries, with Tonga leading the ladder with 100%, while Papua New Guinea has the lowest score of 38.4%. Samoa, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Fiji all have their scores within the fairly good range, and though given the indication as such, they're still within the 90th percentile and could do better if they maximize the available resources that they have currently. Moving on, we have the next right, which is the right to health. This shows the scores for 9 countries, with Australia having a top score of 88.3%, while Samoa has the lowest score of 71.6%. You will notice that all scores given here are ranging within the 70th and 80th percentile, and Australia's score is the only one that hinges on the fair range, meaning that all the other scores given by the other countries are within the bad and the very bad range. And as elaborated on by my colleague earlier, Mena, there are different aspects to find out as to which how this sub-rights have contributed to the main right, which is the right to health by navigating to the sidebar on my right, your right. Moving on to the second last ESR, we have the right to housing. Now, this shows the scores for 14 countries, with New Zealand having the highest score of 100%, while Papua New Guinea has the lowest score of 27.3%. Of each individual ESR right category, the right to housing for Papua New Guinea is the lowest score amongst all of them. And being of Papua New Guinean descent, I can say that this score is congruent with the state in which my country is in, and therefore needs to do much more better by expanding on the resources that it readily has right now. And moving on to the last ESR right, we have the right to work. And this shows the scores for 10 countries, with Tuvalu having the highest score of 100%, while Papua New Guinea has the lowest score of 43.6%. Tonga, Australia, and Samoa all that have their scores within the good range, within the 98th percentile, but as we all know, 100% is the most feasible score, and therefore there is still room for more improvement. That concludes my Pacific ESR overview and comparison. I will be handing it over to my next colleague, Amy, who will be going over the East and Southeast Asian region.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Otto. I'm going to share my screen. And to look at East and Southeast Asia, we'll use the view for income adjusted and low to middle income assessment standards, since these are most applicable to the countries that we'll be looking at. So we're going to begin with the right to education. And I've already filtered it for East Asia. And you'll notice that some countries here are marked with an asterisk. This indicates that the country is high income. And since we're only using income adjusted and low to middle income assessment standards, this means every country with a high income should receive very high scores. Yet we see that on the right to education, Brunei as well as Macau, despite being high income countries, are the worst performers in the region. Now, moving on to the right to food, we can see that most of the countries are performing quite poorly. The worst performers are Laos, Brunei, and Timor-Leste. However, there are a few countries that are performing relatively better than their neighbors. So we can look to China and Mongolia. They stand out as leaders in the region. They are performing among the high-income countries and better than Japan. Next, we have the right to health. So most of the countries in Southeast Asia have largely stagnated in their performance over time. And Mena had mentioned how to find that over time data in the quality of life tab. You just have to go into a specific country. Here we can see that China is at the top of the list, while Japan lags behind most of these countries, and Malaysia and Timor-Leste have the lowest scores. Now we're going to go to the right to housing. And so here we'll see that Thailand and Malaysia are leaders in this region with scores that are comparable to the other high-income countries. And Mongolia stands out as having a very significantly low score of 38% on the right to housing. Last up, we have the right to work. So on the right to work, there is a broader trend in several countries in this region where they've made a lot of improvements over time on the right to work. So the countries that have seen improvements include Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, the Philippines, Thailand, Timor-Leste, China, and Vietnam. Here, there are a few low to middle income countries that are performing among the high income ones. So that includes Thailand, Malaysia, and Myanmar. And then there's Laos and Timor-Leste at the bottom, who have received very low scores in comparison to their peers. So that concludes this brief insight into East and Southeast Asia. And now I'll hand it over to my colleague in Paris, Momoko.
So thank you, Amy. I'll now share my screen to present you the economic and social rights in Europe. So hopefully you'll see my screen here. Okay, So we choose the quality of life, as my other colleagues have done, where we find the 5 economic and social rights with all the scores for 86 countries. I will be focusing on Europe. So I will add this filter, so Europe filter. You can see that not all the European countries are presented here, as we do not have the full data set for some European countries, but the ones indicated here do. So we see here that Belgium has the best income adjusted score of 96%. And this is to say that Belgium is doing 96% of what it is possible at this country's income level for its performance of economic and social rights. The European country with the lowest score, as you can see, is Moldova, where it is doing 83.3% of what it can achieve at its level of income. Now we can switch the view to the global best measure to see how well European countries are doing compared to the rest of the world, including the wealthiest countries. So we see that the order of the score rankings have not really changed in terms of the highest and lowest performing countries, but the rankings have reversed between Serbia and Montenegro and Georgia and Armenia. So, for example, Serbia has ranked higher in the income adjusted score than Montenegro, but now it's reversed. And this is interesting as we see how these scores could show that there is more place for improvement for all these European countries. Now we can also analyze the performance of each economic or social right by European countries. And for instance, now we will look at the right to education. Here we see that there are more countries from Europe represented, since we have a full set of data for these countries on the right to education. I'll go back to the income adjusted mode. We see that Sweden is doing 97.3% of what it could do considering its country's level of income in terms of its performance in right to education. How has it changed over time? As we can see, Sweden has been the highest performer in terms of the right to education since 2017. It was overtaken the UK since 2017. I will now hand over to my colleague Eduardo, who will interview Susan regarding the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thanks, Omoko. And we have our Hermes co-founder, Susan Randolph, back. Susan, how do Hermes economic and social rights metrics relate to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs?
I guess I'd say in a nutshell that Hermes economic and social rights metrics are an important complement to the SDGs, and actually vice versa. While there are a number of differences between the two approaches, there's also a number of similarities. And additionally, there's ways in which the two approaches are synergistic.
So it will be correct to say that the two monitor the same thing?
Oh, no, not at all. So Hermes economic and social rights metrics monitor the extent to which countries are meeting commitments that they have made under international law. That is, Hermes scores tell you the extent to which countries are meeting key legal obligations that they have taken on by ratifying particular international treaties. So most centrally here, it would be the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In contrast, while countries have committed to strive to meet the sustainable development goals, they're not really under any legal obligation to do so. So as its name implies, via the word goals, they're really aspirational in nature. They are not legal commitments.
But having said that, there are strong connections between both human rights monitoring and tracking progress of the SDGs, right?
Yes, that's correct, absolutely. And indeed, if you look at the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, I can quote that it, quote, seeks to realize the human rights of all. So it's not really surprising that there is some overlap here. And in fact, we see that a number of the Sustainable Development Goals actually mirror the rights that Hermes takes a look at, the economic and social rights that Hermes measures. So for the right to education, it really mirrors Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is focused on ensuring quality education for all. For the right to health, that one pretty much encompasses Sustainable Development Goal number 3, which seeks to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages. When it comes to the right to food, we see that that pretty much overlaps with Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which is focused on ending hunger and achieving food security. And for the right to housing, we actually see that it includes elements of 2 different Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal number 6, which is looking at ensuring access to safe water and sanitation, and also Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which seeks to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, and resilient and sustainable. Finally, for the right to work, that one actually has elements of Sustainable Goal number 1, 8, and 10, and that it focuses on poverty. Those goals focus on poverty, on growth that provides productive employment, and on reducing inequality. Additionally, we could argue that since a lot of Hermes data are disaggregated by sex, that we also provide information related to Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is seeking to achieve gender equality and empower women and girls. In fact, many of the raw indicators that we actually use to construct Hermes scores are the exact same indicators used to assess progress towards the SDG targets.
So considering that the Hermes metric score cover issues that are addressed by the SDGs, why can't we use the country's progress on the SDGs to monitor exactly the compliance with, for example, the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights? What do Hermes metrics reveal that we cannot learn from just checking out the SDGs?
Well, quite a few things, actually. The award-winning methodology, the SERP methodology, used in constructing Hermes income-adjusted scores, brings something that's quite unique to the assessment process. So if you look at the benchmarks used to assess performance by the SDGs, we find that the benchmark is identical for all countries. So consider SDG target number 2.1, which says by 2030, end hunger and ensure access by all people to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food all year round. So one of the SDG indicators used to track progress towards this goal is the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity in the population. And the SDGs benchmark all countries, that is, look at their progress relative to the goal of 100% of people being food secure. And indeed, we could say Hermes scores that use the global best benchmark do something similar. However, that's not the only benchmark that Hermes uses. As has been noted, we use something called the income adjusted scores. So what's the rationale behind that? Everyone knows that it's easier for a rich country to make sure all people have enough to eat to grow healthy, and than it is for a lower middle income country. So if we simply assess each country against the same benchmark, it doesn't hold them equally to account. And the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights really acknowledges this. While it obligates all countries to ensure that the rights in the covenant are eventually enjoyed by all people, countries' ultimate obligations we monitor. This is the country's ultimate obligation we monitor using our global best scores. The covenant also recognizes that not all countries currently have the resources to do so. As such, if you look at Article 2.1 of the covenant, we find that what countries are obligated to do is to use the maximum of their available resources to progressively ensure all enjoy the rights in the covenant. So thus, Hermes assesses all countries' performance relative to a benchmark, the benchmark we've been talking about called the income adjusted benchmark, that takes into account each country's level of development. So Hermes income adjusted economic and social rights scores reveal the extent to which each country is using the maximum of its available resources to achieve the right concerned. And tracked over time, Hermes income adjusted scores reveal the extent to which countries are progressively realizing the rights concerned as required by the treaty.
But don't the SDGs also recognize how poor countries have those resource constraints? For example, SDG 17 requires that 12 countries help poor countries to reach those goals as well.
Yes, that's true. But none of the SDG indicators provides guidance as to which countries face binding resource constraints and which countries can actually dramatically improve their performance by improving policies, laws, or economic structures even. So Hermes income adjusted scores allow you to distinguish between those countries that are doing poorly because they're really not using their resources very well and they have poor policies, versus those countries that are doing the best that they can given their available resources and would actually require either additional income or development aid or technical assistance to be able to do better. Hermes income adjusted scores, unlike the SDGs, also allow you to learn how much more a country could do if it simply used its resources more effectively. That's not to say it will necessarily reach its 100% enjoyment target, but it does imply that many countries can actually make considerable progress on their own without outside resources. On the other hand, for resource-constrained countries, Hermes metrics additionally provide information on how much help those countries are likely to need in order to reach a particular SDG target, even if they do the best that they can with their available resources. And we can actually get a good insight into that by looking at the difference between Hermes Global Best and income adjusted benchmarks for the countries on the indicator concerned.
So finally, you had mentioned how the SDG data also complement what they learned from Hermes economic and social rights metrics. How so?
Well, Hermes economic and social rights metrics are actually intended to provide a high-level overview of a country's economic and social rights performance. But they don't actually take a look at the policies that countries might use to improve their performance. They don't provide too much insight there, unless one is simply comparing the performance of countries on a particular right, one that does well and one that does poorly, but it doesn't directly do it. The SDG indicators, in contrast, when they set specific targets, they usually have a number of different indicators that one wants to track towards meeting those targets. And those different indicators, some would argue, are actually causal to reaching the desired outcome. So let's take an example of SDG 2, which is end hunger and achieve food security and improve nutrition. It doesn't just monitor things such as food security. It also looks at agricultural productivity, at the incomes of small-scale food producers, at genetic resources available for food and animal production, at government expenditures on agriculture, and so on. So many other factors are actually included there. So thus, a country that gets a low score on Hermes income-adjusted measures can actually gain some insights into the policies that might help them do better by looking at their performance on these alternative causal indicators that also affect, for example, nutrition.
Thank you, Susan. We actually have an article on our website summing up some of what Susan has said here. So feel free to take a look at that for reference. Now back to you, Talia.
Thanks so much, Eduardo and Susan. I'm now going to invite Dr. Stephen Bagwell, one of our economic and social rights researchers, to join me. I can't see you on the screen, Stephen, but I assume they're in there somewhere. There we go, very good. Excuse me. So you've been looking at what our data have shown over the years on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's start at the start. How did the start of the COVID-19 pandemic impact economic and social rights around the world?
Sure. So there were several notable ways the pandemic immediately impacted economic and social rights. First, as lockdowns went into place, education shifted to remote learning strategies. This was common across a large number of countries, almost every single one in our survey mentioned this for 2020. This had a really negative impact on students who did not have reliable internet access. Those from a lower socioeconomic background were particularly at risk, and there was also some mention of sort of urban-rural divides and ethnic minority groups being particularly vulnerable to not having reliable internet access. Second, hospitals were using a lot of their capacity to fight the pandemic, shifting more of their resources that direction towards life-saving treatments for COVID-19, which lessened fulfillment of the right to health for those needing non-COVID healthcare. Third, the right to work was severely impacted as many countries shut down public life. Some workers were deemed essential. These workers were almost always people who were systematically vulnerable. Respondents identified women, ethnic minorities, and migrants who continued to show up to work and increase the probability that they would in turn be exposed to COVID-19. Fourth, the right to food and adequate nutrition was negatively affected. Often governments provided culturally inappropriate food to those in lockdown or quarantine. They adopted policies that made food prohibitively expensive and excluded people like immigrants from receiving food support. Finally, the right to housing suffered, with respondents again identifying racial and ethnic minorities and women and girls as being particularly at risk. Obviously, homeless populations were at risk. Some of them were placed in temporary housing early in the pandemic, which would have been an improvement in terms of fulfilling the right to housing, but those accommodations were removed, and then they were once again back out on the street. Even countries which implemented eviction moratoriums for people who lost their jobs often enforced those moratoriums unevenly.
So basically lots of bad news. How has that evolved throughout 2021?
So there were a few common themes. Some countries began to reopen in 2021, while others were still in the middle of a wave of infections. Some countries experienced a little bit of both. But by the end of 2021, many countries had access to a variety of COVID vaccines, but rollouts were delayed or they occurred unevenly. And systemic racism and a lack of education led many to be skeptical of receiving a vaccine. This was true in a number of countries, but just to highlight one, in Brazil, Black people and Indigenous people faced a number of obstacles to receiving vaccinations. In the United States, where there's a history of pharmaceutical companies experimenting on minorities, there is more vaccine skepticism among people of color in the United States, which lessened the vaccine uptake in those communities. The right to education also continued to see a lack of fulfillment, with, again, respondents identifying ethnic minorities, economically disenfranchised individuals, and children with physical or mental disabilities being particularly at risk. When countries reopened, many discontinued COVID relief policies, which undid some of the fixes that they may have implemented in the short term for vulnerable groups. I would say overall, if there's one recurring theme, it's that historical or institutional legacies of inequity really exacerbated problems related to the pandemic. There were some short-term fixes. If anything, it shows that governments have the resources when they're motivated to get things done, but oftentimes have lacked the political will to get things done. It didn't come up in our data, but one thing that I read about fairly recently was that Australia was one of these countries that accommodated a large number of homeless people, basically solving their homelessness problem overnight. And then when they decided COVID was no longer a big problem, stopped accommodating those homeless people and recreated their homeless problem overnight, which really speaks to a lack of political will, not so much a lack of resources. I will say, on a brighter note, COVID seemed to prevent a slightly less problem for respect for economic and social rights in 2021 than in 2020. Health, the right to health and the right to education were still heavily disrupted by for many countries in our survey, but there were fewer mentions overall.
So any hope for the future? What are you thinking is likely to happen in the next year or two?
Sure. So I think there are more efforts still underway to sort of tackle COVID and be proactive. And I think that that's promising, that sometimes it takes a while for these systemic inequalities to be overcome. To overcome vaccine skepticism that's been pervasive for generations for good reason. That's going to take some time, but I think it's possible. If there are other bright spots to take away, it's that there's a growing consciousness that all rights are interrelated and often reinforcing. I'll use something that came up in our India data as an example. Respondents emphasized that immigrants were at risk for losing fulfillment to the right to work, which also impacted fulfillment of the right to food. This was something that was mentioned sort of hand in hand, and a growing consciousness that small policy fixes either can alleviate the problem or fix a problem across multiple rights areas, I think is important. A little bit of investment from governments can oftentimes go a long way. I think that's a bright spot. And then many respondents identified systemic inequalities, structural racism, migrant workers, similar themes like this as problematic, identifying these groups as people who were particularly at risk because of the pandemic. I think a growing awareness of and empathy for those who suffer from unjust political and economic structures provides some hope that steps will be taken in the future to mitigate systemic oppression.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to hold on to that hope, and we will all around the world be working together to try and bring that to fruition. Thank you, Stephen. I'm now going to bring in our special guest, Lena Simmet, who is a senior researcher and advocate on poverty and inequality at Human Rights Watch. Thank you, Lena, for being with us and for listening to do all of that and looking through the data yourself earlier, I know. Lena's research focuses on social protection, labour rights and non-standard forms of employment like the app-based gig economy, and how austerity-driven budget cuts and the privatisation of basic essential services can undermine human rights. So given those specialties, Lena, welcome. I'm wondering, when you looked through this year's data, what has stood out for you?
Thank you so much, Talia. And just to say that I'm really excited to be here today, and it's been a really wonderful webinar. Looking through the data, I think, you know, it showed very clearly that there's so much room for improvement, especially in regards to poverty and inequality indicators, which are the ones that I mainly looked at. Which almost suggests that we're sort of in a crisis moment regarding social and economic rights, where in 2021, nearly 10% of the global population was living in extreme poverty. And those are data from the World Bank using a very low, in my opinion, too low of a threshold of $1.90 a day. So we're looking at the Hermes data on poverty, which is a sub category of the work score. I noticed that not only are scores quite low in many countries, but also some countries have deteriorated over time. So I compared the 2019 data to the 2007 data and noticed that more than 30 countries, in fact, dropped in their score. So are performing worse now than they had in the past in terms of poverty. And I was also looking at the food score, since I'm currently working on food security issues, and also noticed that nearly 20 countries had declining scores in food, which relates to food security and food access. So these are quite concerning numbers that we noticed that even before the pandemic, scores were quite low and deteriorating. So again, this calls for greater investments and more improvements from the government side in these aspects.
And so how do those scores resonate with what you see in your own research at Human Rights Watch?
Unfortunately, they resonate quite well. So these are trends that we are seeing repeatedly in our work, and that we have seen deteriorate further during the pandemic, where poverty as well as hunger and food insecurity have risen. And although some countries, and similar to what Stephen just described, have introduced new systems to protect people from economic insecurity, many are highly inadequate, right? And that was the case already before the pandemic, where social protection systems are highly exclusionary, so they often exclude informal workers, or they have certain conditionalities that make it incredibly difficult for people to access support. And here I think there's a very clear link to social and political rights that would require citizenship cards. For instance, that's the case in Nepal, where people without citizenship cards are excluded from all sorts of public services and social security. And that then leads to data such as 4 billion people currently not covered by any form of social protection. That's data by the ILO.
So many of us hoped, and Stephen was talking about this, that we hoped that at the start of the pandemic that government responses might actually lead to improvements in some rights. But as Stephen said, that's not actually what we observed in our data. What about in your research?
Yeah, unfortunately, very, very similar findings. We had hopes at the beginning, since there was quite some attention paid to the inequalities that were inherent in the health sector, also in economic terms. And we've seen these quite dramatic expansions of safety nets, I have to say, where there was a very different response in 2020 compared to 2008 after the financial crisis. So this gave some hope that this time things would be different. However, we again quickly saw falling back into very, very well-known approaches where expansions were short-lived, highly temporary, continued to exclude certain populations, including informal workers, etc. But also that we are already now seeing sort of a new wave of austerity, right? Which is again something we had seen post 2008. And I think what we are seeing now is in fact an even worse situation where there's a global food crisis on the way, which in part is due to the pandemic, but also due to the war in Ukraine, which has sort of reinforcing quite negative trends.
So, Hermes, we're a data producer. We're not advocates ourselves. So it's great to be talking with you, as Human Rights Watch is, of course, a key advocacy organisation globally. So I'm wondering, how do governments react when you advocate for more investment in economic and social rights? And I'm also interested, how do you see that Hermes data can be useful in discussions about budget allocations and what's achievable in countries?
Yeah, one of the most common things we hear from governments as we push for more investments in economic and social rights is the lack of resources. And that certain countries at very limited budget lines, or in low-income countries, simply don't have the resources needed to invest in education and healthcare systems. And this is, I think, where the Hermes data is so powerful. Now that we're not comparing Nepal to France, but we're in fact comparing countries at similar income levels to demonstrate, hold on, this can be achieved, and in fact has been achieved by some of your peers. And for us, this is also useful since we're often perceived as sort of a naming and shaming organization, pointing out only the flaws. But by using this data, I think we can also encourage governments to learn from one another, right? So why is it that this other country has made these huge achievements and has achieved this better score? So how do we learn from them, right? Rather than finger pointing and the low results. But I think, when we talk about the progressive realization of rights, we also try to communicate to countries that they need to expand, so make progress and achievements quickly, and they need to gather the revenue to do so, right? And so they can simply say, well, we have low resources, low revenues. This is simply our limit, but in fact, push them to expand their budget, to expand their fiscal boundaries to further invest in economic and social rights.
So what's your message? We're coming to the end of our time together. So let's have a call to action. What is your message to governments and decision makers? Where are we up to now and where do we need to be?
So governments, in our view, need to fully commit to economic and social rights. And the failure to do so will lead to immense suffering in the coming years. So that includes more people in poverty. It also includes social unrest and protests, as we're already witnessing in several countries, including in Ecuador, Lebanon, Kazakhstan, so really across different regions. And many of these protests are in response to economic policies and the dire economic situations that we are seeing. So, and we also have to acknowledge, of course, that we are in difficult economic terms, now with rising debt levels that have been accumulated during the pandemic and economic recessions in several places, as well as pressures from international financial institutions such as the World Bank or the IMF to cut spending and introduce austerity measures that cut spending to services essential to economic and social rights. So I'm saying this because I think I would have two main messages for governments, that even though we are in this difficult economic situations, there are alternatives to austerity measures. And austerity, as we have researched it in the past, is in most circumstances quite harmful to human rights, but it is not inevitable, right? So there are alternatives such as increasing tax revenue, so basically increasing the pie rather than simply cutting out certain aspects that are then harmful to rights. And the other aspect also, simply to highlight that we're not talking about pure expenses, right? But investing in social and economic rights is in fact a very positive and economically speaking, an advancing way of progressing a country. And so we therefore advocate for more counter-cyclical fiscal measures, which are good for growth, but also good for rights. So this means as economies are struggling, investing more in social economic rights rather than cutting back.
Thank you so much for your time and your expertise, Lena, for joining us. We look forward to continued partnership in the human rights revolution. Thank you everybody for joining us today, for everybody who's been listening and everybody who's been contributing, presenting. Now, whatever kind of use anyone might have for our data, we are here to help. We at Hermes really enjoy helping people understand our data and figure out how to use it in your own work. So please get in touch with me if you have any questions. My email address will be in the chat box, and you can all just contact me directly if there's any way that we can help. We also have several workshops recorded on our YouTube channel in different languages. Please make use of those resources. We are now at the end of our time together. So let me just remind you that you can keep up with our work anytime by following us on social media and signing up for occasional email newsletters. The details have been in the chat box. You might want to go and copy them before the webinar closes. And you can always just find us online. We're pretty easy to Google. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, in this human rights revolution that we are all working towards to make the world better, kinder, and fairer. I hope you all have a wonderful day and evening and week, and we look forward to partnering with you in the future. Thanks, everybody.